Dear OLLI friends, we are in the world in the age of the coronavirus, and we want to experiment with my doing some short recordings, not to bore you with more discussions about the situation in the United States, but to try to put the U.S. in perspective in world affairs and to talk about the rest of the world, which is really not getting adequate attention. I would very much appreciate it if you all would give me feedback, both in terms of future topics, because today I'll just sort of run down various issues and identify them, as well as questions you may have. My email is Ronnie, RONNIE, at UCSC.edu. So please give me some feedback. Does this work? Do you have topics that you would like me to discuss, etc.? Now, everybody is talking about the transformation of, let's say, the U.S. that will be taking place because of this pandemic. But I want to argue that the world will also be transformed, and that it's useful now, as this is happening, to begin to be aware of and to look for changes in world affairs, which are not just of intellectual interest, but will also have a bearing on our future as Americans. The first topic, I think, is the changing role of the U.S. in world affairs, which I think is not redeemable after this pandemic is over. We were anyway in decline as a world power, but we're now going to be looked at in a very different light, it seems to me, than we were before the pandemic. The dysfunctionality of the United States is not just Trump and his presidency, but will be shown that as a country, we are not what others believed us to be, namely the wealthiest country in the world, which is at the forefront of technology, of economics, of various resources, etc. What this pandemic has shown is that we really can't manage our own affairs very well. And while it's true that a different president might be doing a better job and organizing the acquisition and distribution of various kinds of medical needs, as Governor Cuomo keeps mentioning, we should have a national system, a national inventory, we should be able to move things around, we should have a national policy so that some states have strict rules, other states have no rules, some states have church services, other states don't allow more than 2 people to meet, and so forth. That all is so visible to the world, and our dysfunctionality as a society, which used to be the role model for the world, is, I think, not only eroding, but I think it will have transformed the possibility of the U.S. playing leadership roles in various ways. In addition, the fact that the U.S. is bad-mouthing other countries on the one hand, and international institutions on the other hand, is also showing in many ways lack of leadership. Yes, China has made mistakes. Yes, the World Health Organization has made mistakes. But the fact that some institutions and countries are not functioning according to our desires or our hope does not mean that we wash our hands rather than exercise leadership to improve the situation. The international institutions, be they public, like intergovernmental institutions like the World Health Organizations, or non-governmental organizations, are a very important part of the global landscape. And the U.S. lack of contributions to these institutions and lack of leadership of these institutions is raising world awareness at a very time when President Trump is arguing that we are overpaying to international institutions. I'll talk more about that down the road sometime, but let it be said that from the very beginning, the amount of money that each country contributes to these institutions is based on its economic power, its economic well-being. And while it's true that the U.S. contributes more than some other countries, this is based on almost mechanical aspects. And over the years, as other countries have become richer, the U.S. contributions have actually gone down. This is a little technical and complicated, but it's not rocket science. The other thing is, even at the beginning of this pandemic, we reduced the amount of our budget contributions, let's say, to the World Health Organization. So if anything, we are harming the institutions that could help, number one. Number two, we're not exercising leadership in those institutions to make them more functional. So all in all, we're doing much to undermine the international system, which admittedly we helped to build after the Second World War. In addition, we are in our bilateral relationships with all kinds of European countries, with China, with Israel, with Iran, and so forth. We are doing irreparable damage, not just with respect to our bilateral relationships with those countries, but we're doing irreparable damage in the eyes of the world in terms of intelligent U.S. policies and leadership that other countries should emulate. Finally, just by way of rattling off various topics, there are all these other global issues which are not going away. Poverty, for example, in Africa, climate change, and so forth. And we're so fixated on the pandemic that we're not keeping in mind the relationship of, one, our reduced leadership role, and number two, the relationship of the pandemic to some of these issues. So, for example, if one wants to address the pandemic in the future for the world, one also has to start worrying about what happens if that pandemic goes out of control, let's say on the African continent, or let's say in Brazil. And the international aspects of that, that is to say, the international aspects of the problems, even if conquered in individual Western industrial countries and in China, that are generated by this pandemic, is worth paying some attention to at this point in time. We are the main contributors to international institutions. This is true, technically speaking. When these institutions were founded, the predominant budget, which is assessed based on the economy of each country, was that of the United States. On the other hand, we have reduced, as other countries' economic well-being has increased, our contribution to the budget. Even so, Trump is perfectly correct that we are still contributing more than other countries. On the other hand, of course, we are still richer than other countries, and our economies are still much larger. So it needs to be taken with a grain of salt that we are over-contributing to world organizations. Now, it is obviously the case that the one that is most focused on at the moment is the World Trade Organization. The World Health Organization. On the other hand, of course, it is the health organization with a lot of expertise which could be helping. It is also the case that we are noticing both nationally and internationally that the process of distributing medical information, medical hardware, whether it's breathing machines or masks or anything of that sort, is operating very much on an ad hoc basis. And what this pandemic is showing us, not just that we need some centralized control nationally, but internationally, so that the supplies that are needed to fight a pandemic can be organized and not be based on an ad hoc basis. You might have noticed that Italy, which has had a very, very bad outbreak and was very needy, has been supported by, for example, Chinese doctors going to Italy to help with the pandemic. Now, that's on an ad hoc bilateral basis. The notion that there would be a reservoir of both governmental and non-governmental, for example, Doctors Without Borders, inventory of who and what is available that could be sent around various parts of the world is badly needed. But this sort of thing requires leadership, right? And we're clearly not in a leadership position. In fact, we're bashing every imaginable institution in other countries and arrogantly telling the world that we are better than anybody else, we are in charge, and we're looking out for ourselves. So what I'm saying here is that the institutional structure which could help in a situation like this, the institutional of health matters, the institutional structure which could help in terms of, let's say, the refugee crisis or the climate crisis, none of that is working properly. None of that is being led by the U.S., and all of that is fraying for one reason or another for lack of leadership. So our abandonment of a world leadership role is one of the spin-offs, and serious spin-offs, of this particular crisis. Beyond that is, of course, the larger question of globalization of everything. And there are alarmists that are saying, okay, countries are closing their borders so the virus doesn't spread. Is this the end of globalization? I actually think this is a major topic which we need to discuss down the road, but I would also say that I don't think the answer is yes. Modern technology, modern trade, modern information, the movements of goods and people will not come to an end. It may be true that a country like the United States under Trump says, in the future, we're going to produce everything ourselves and be not at all reliant on the trade, let's say, between the United States and China. But this is just a lot of political hyperbole, because the way the modern world, the postmodern world, if you will, operates does not allow for hard borders, for lack of transmission of goods, of people, and of information. Globalization may change in certain ways, and countries may link into it in somewhat different ways. But the idea that the pandemic shows that this is the end of globalization makes absolutely no sense to me, and it's really a topic for further discussion. Then one gets to discussions of other parts of the world as part of the global perspective. Excuse me. For example, Europe. Europe, as the European Economic Community, the European Union, is also fraying at the seams. And it is creating border barriers because of the virus. It is creating tensions amongst countries. It is not just Brexit, but it's also the behavior of some members of the European Union that is questioning the future of the European Union. Now, I don't think the European Union will come to an end, just as I don't think globalization will come to an end. But I am wanting to argue that there will be a transformation in the European Union, and that is also worth discussing. Now, having raised the European Union, allow me to say something about the political impact globally. Not only are countries finding it difficult to cope, but actual and potential authoritarian leaders are also transforming the international realm in terms of the politics or the nature of politics amongst the units of the world. And here the word is democratization. Democratization was the post-end of the Cold War hope on everybody's part. And it is very true that many countries democratized in one way or another. And it is even true to say that the U.S. helped that process. But over time, various kinds of authoritarian or near authoritarian leaders have come into power in various parts of the world. And that is also true in Europe. That is true with respect to Hungary, that is true with respect to Poland. And during this crisis, one has seen, and you've probably read or heard, that, for example, Orban, the dictator, but I'm calling him a dictator at this point, of Hungary, has essentially become 100% dictator. He has gotten rid of every law, every institution, every checks and balances. This, by the way, is against the rules of the European Union, and it will be interesting to see what the European Union does after this pandemic crisis is over about the various members of the European Union, Hungary, Poland, to some extent Czechoslovakia and others, who've used this opportunity to centralize and to get rid, really, of the infrastructure of democracy in their countries. So one of the interesting spin-offs for the European Union is not simply an economic spin-off. To what extent can they keep the borders open and eventually get some kind of changes in the European Union? Will they become more flexible with regard to their trade, their economic systems, their financial systems, and the politics of various countries? It is mighty hard to say how this will all end, but it's certainly worth watching. So the transformations that are happening in the world are not just the transformations of the pandemic, but the transformations of the politics and the economics which this pandemic is producing. It is also worth saying something about the aspects of other parts of the world which are also coming untangled. For example, the European Union. The European Union is under very serious stress. And we need to discuss that. Democracy around the world is under very serious stress, and we need to discuss that. The World War II, post-World War II, post-Cold War international system is coming unraveled, and what will replace it is far from clear. So I think we need to say to ourselves, while we're fixated on our domestic situation, which of course we should be fixated on, it's worthwhile for those of us who like to think outside the box and outside just the U.S., it's worthwhile for us to think how, as the world is changing, what do we make of it? Where do we stand? What are our opinions? And to what extent can we eventually, even as citizens, have an input into the new world that we all, our children and grandchildren, will live in? So if you will bear with this sort of experiment, it's a little bit messy, and give some feedback to us. If this works at all, we can then proceed, and I can do some substantive lectures, maybe 20 minutes, half an hour down the road. Thanks very much for listening.